Hi, I'm back. Sorry, a little bit of technical difficulty there. We'll see if I can get through the rest of this explanatory video on the PowerPoint Rastafari. Anyway, we were talking about Haile Selassie, the emperor who was coronated in Ethiopia in 1930. You have the more secular looking photo on your right from the cover of Time magazine. And the caption there, the King of Kings, Negusa Nagast. That's, again, a royal title, and it's a messianic title taken from the Bible. And the other title that was bestowed upon him is Conquering Lion of the Tribe of Judah, which in the Hebrew Bible, the tribe of Judah in the 12 tribes of Israel was the regal or royal messianic tribe. It was King David's tribe, and his son, King Solomon, ruled over Israel and built the first temple in the holy city, the city of Jerusalem, that David had taken as the capital of his tribe, the Judahites, literally, from which we get the term Judaism or Judaism. So you can see how Rastafarians would very early on, right at the coronation of this Ethiopian prince as emperor of Ethiopia, they would be picking up on all of this, right? His various names and their Christian significance, his tie to the Solomonic dynasty, and hence a true Israelite. And you can see how Haile Selassie, not just for Rastafarians, but for Afro-Caribbeans, African Americans, they would look to him as a very positive image of blackness, of Africanness, coming from the eastern portion of the continent of Africa, from the eastern horn of Africa, as it's referred to. And so he becomes this luminous, shining image of true Africanness, true messianism in a sense, an anointed king, an anointed leader. That's what the term Mashiach in Hebrew means, right? Or Christ in Greek, Christos. It means an anointed king, one who's set apart and chosen by God to rule his people. And so you can see how for many people living in oppressive conditions, especially in the Western Hemisphere, direct descendants of slaves, and the cruelty that institution brought upon these peoples, that Haile Selassie, in a sense, symbolizes everything that is good about blackness and Africanness. And for Rastafarians, then, he becomes the messianic figure. He becomes the embodiment of Christ in his kingly character, prophesied in the book of the Apocalypse, or the book of Revelation, the final book of the Christian Bible. And he's the conquering lion of the tribe of Judah, descended from David's son Solomon, and this African queen, the Queen of Sheba, in direct lineage according to the Ethiopian monarchical descent. So I give you his dates here. He was coronated 2nd November 1930. He valiantly resisted, against odds, resisted the Italian fascists under Mussolini, and there was a war that was fought between his army, the Ethiopians, and the Italians at a certain point. So he's on the side of good against the evil forces, and this also gets played upon in the imagery of Rastafarianism. He's fighting for good. He's the conquering lion of the tribe of Judah, the messianic, the anointed one, the Christ. God incarnate in his blackness. Okay, that's also an important enduring idea. Not in Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity, but in Rastafari, in the Rastafari faith. He ruled Ethiopia for a long time. He did lots of important things, went on lots of state visits. He attended JFK's funeral in Washington, D.C. in the early 60s after his assassination. He attended this funeral and was given sort of a prominence of place when he would visit as a foreign dignitary, because he was a founding member of the Organization of African Unity, or OAU. And in the song War, I put some links to some reggae music in this PowerPoint presentation. But if you touch on the song War, you'll see a live version of Bob Marley. And what he did was he took Emperor Haile Selassie's address to the United Nations on the issue of human rights and inequality in Africa and the African nations at the hands of the colonial oppressors, the Europeans, etc. He took the words of the speech, Bob Marley did, and he set it to music, and he sings that very poignantly. And so, anyway, if you listen to that and you listen to the words of that Bob Marley song, War, it's literally, in the Rastafari faith, the words of the Black Messiah, right? The Black Christ in his kingly character, the Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia. Okay, let's go to the next slide here, and you should see a picture of Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey is an interesting figure. He himself was a Christian. He started out in a Methodist school and then converted to Roman Catholicism at a certain point and was a Roman Catholic. So he wasn't a Rastafarian by faith, but Rastafarianism really drew upon some of his Pan-Africanism and his idea of this repatriation of the African diaspora back to the motherland. The other thing about Marcus Garvey is that's significant in Rastafari is he's viewed as sort of a John the Baptist type. So if you can kind of understand the Rastafarian take on interpreting scripture, the notion in the Christian Gospels is that John the Baptist, when asked, "Are you the Christ?" by the high priests, "Are you the Messiah? Are you the one who has been promised?" he was pretty quick to say, "No, I am not. I'm not even worthy to untie his sandal thong." But he says, when the Christ comes, when the Messiah comes, you will know him, and he will purge you like they would do with wheat, and he will separate the wheat from the chaff, and the chaff gets thrown into the fire, etc. So the Messiah, then John the Baptist identifies himself as sort of a forerunner, the one who prepares the way of the Lord, right, of the Messiah. And then Jesus of Nazareth shows up on the scene, obviously, in the Gospels, and he is the Christ according to Christianity. So Rastafarians really look at Marcus Garvey as a John the Baptist type, a forerunner of the Emperor Haile Selassie of Christ. And he's important because he really was the first. He himself was born in Jamaica. He lived for a time in America. He was jailed for a while. Ultimately, he was expelled from the United States. Some believe under trumped up charges by the FBI. And he lived in London for a while. He went back to Jamaica and spent some time there. And he had tried to organize a Pan-Africanist movement. and became the director of a movement called UNIA, the United Negro Improvement Association. He had a lot of members in that, and he organized a shipping line called the Black Star. He did lots of things. He had a newspaper going in right around the time of World War I. President Woodrow Wilson, League of Nations, all of this stuff is going on. And into the 1920s, ultimately he was sort of disaffected, and he didn't live a long life. He suffered from asthma and would have bouts of pneumonia for a while, and this sort of plagued him throughout his life. And so you can see from his dates, he lived to be about 53, I think. And so he didn't live a long life. But one thing that he did was and the Rastafarians really pick up on this, he took a verse from the book of Psalms in the Hebrew Bible, and it says, Ethiopia will stretch forth its hand to God. And he said, this is a prophecy, and you will need to look for an African, a black man, to be coronated as king, and he will become this jewel, in a sense, this shining star that will be the harbinger of a Pan-Africanist movement, where all of the Africans will get on ships and they will be transported back to the promised land. It's interesting, though, later in the 1930s, that Marcus Garvey was critical at times of the Emperor Haile Selassie, the fact that he was, this reigning absolute monarch, and that not all of his subjects were living in good conditions, and etc. So even though he felt very strongly about Haile Selassie and his role as a black king, he nevertheless felt free to be critical also of abuses when he perceived those at the hands of Haile Selassie during his rule. So Marcus Garvey, interesting character. He dies in London in 1940, and he is revered not only by the Rastafarians as a John the Baptist type. There were some other Africanist new religious movements, one of which, interestingly enough, becomes the Nation of Islam, and its sort of take on that black nationalism. And so some of the early figures in the Nation of Islam were also heavily influenced by this back to Africa, Pan-Africanism, this idea of Marcus Garvey as sort of a John the Baptist type for the Africans in dispersion. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about the Wailers. The next slide has a couple of photos of Robert Nesta Marley, referred to as Bob Marley. Bob Marley, very charismatic, wonderful songwriter, great musician, great acoustical guitar player, just a real magnetic personality, one of these guys that you like to be around. And he always had a kind of a big group, a big posse, a big following, a huge musical group. And when they would go on tour, he had an entourage, and from all standpoints, even people who didn't really like him or identify at least with him because of their political stance or their position in Jamaica and Jamaican politics, they nevertheless recognized something special about Bob. One thing of note to mention about Bob Marley is he is of mixed parentage. His father is referred to generically as a white Jamaican. His mother was considerably younger, and she was She was black. She's still alive. There was a good documentary done on Bob Marley a few years ago, a handful of years ago, and it incorporates some clips of interviews done with Bob Marley's mother. His father never really hung around much. Now, one other interesting detail, I think, religiously speaking, is there's some tie-in. His father was not just a typical, British guy, but they said he had some lineage that tied him into Syria and possibly some Jewish heritage, which I think is fascinating. So understand that Bob Marley is a black Jamaican by birth, but like President Obama, he's of mixed parentage, and so that already makes it interesting there, just his family background, and then the fact that possibly, Bob Marley gets involved in this Rastafarian movement at a certain stage of his life and helps to popularize it. And quite possibly on his father's side, even though his father is referred to generically as a white Jamaican, could have been from Middle Eastern parentage and have some Jewish background. So there might be some sort of tie-in there as well, which I think is really fascinating. I put in the quote from an interview. This is pretty famous, and this gets you can hear the audio on this if you go on YouTube. But Bob Marley is being interviewed by a Western press guy, and he says, in the interview, he says, "Can you tell the people what it means being a Rastafarian?" And Bob Marley responds and says, "I would say to the people, be still and know that His Imperial Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia is the Almighty. Now the Bible says so, Babylon newspaper says so, and I, the children, says so, So I don't see how much more reveal our people want. What them want? A white God? Well, God come black. True, true." And so we see in this that, in a sense, Rastafari is very much a reaction to the perceived white colonial Christianity in the history of Jamaica. Church of England, King James Version, authorized version of the scriptures, which many of the Rastas use. But they have their own way of interpreting these various scriptures. So even here, Bob is doing a little scriptural interpretation in the book of Psalms. Be still and know that I am God, right? Be still and know that His Imperial Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia is God, or is the Almighty. God, we don't want a white God. God comes black. So understand that that the imagery from Israelite religion, from Judaism, from Christianity is being drawn upon here and reinterpreted in a very Afrocentric way. Okay, the other two Wailers. The picture on the next slide on your extreme left is Peter Tosh. Peter Tosh, when I got into reggae music in the late 80s, Peter Tosh had just died. He had been murdered by some gangbanger types in Jamaica. They tried to get some money out of him. He told them he didn't have any cash in the house. They broke in. They took various of his friends hostage. It was pretty brutal. Ultimately, they were frustrated and they were drunk, supposedly, these three guys. And they had held Peter Tosh and many of his closest friends in Peter Tosh's home hostage all throughout the day. And ultimately, they were frustrated and they started shooting. And Tosh was killed. A famous Jamaican DJ was killed. There was one other man who was killed, and then many people were injured from bullets, etc. The three guys, the henchman was jailed. He received the death penalty, but at some point in the 90s, that was commuted. and I think he's still in prison. A couple of the other guys, one of the guys was let go after the trial because they said the evidence, was flimsy. And then the other one, I think, did some time, but maybe not a lot of time, and was released as well. But pretty heinous. And Tosh was a very magnetic character. If you put him next to Bob was rather short of stature, and Tosh was very tall. And so Tosh, once the Wailers split up and it was no longer the trio with the backup band, and they all kind of went their own ways, Bob was the charismatic, prophetic type, real magnetic on stage. Bunny was the strong, silent type, the ganja smoker. They all smoked ganja, obviously, but Bunny kind of really got into the religious aspect of that. And he was very more on the soft-spoken side, let's say, but a great performer live. And Tosh was more of your militant. He came out with an album called Equal Rights in the late 70s, and I remember I wore that album out when I got a copy of that in the 80s, and really militant, Rastafarian. We're fighting the revolution, and we're going to bring Babylon down, etc. And so his untimely death in 1987, being murdered in this, this mishap where these gang guys break into his home, etc. Very unfortunate. And I never got a chance to see Peter Tosh perform live. I did see his son Andrew Tosh in the 90s at some point, House of Blues in Hollywood perform, and he did at the time. Not as charismatic obviously as his father, but still pretty good, and he did a lot of his father's songs and then some of his own. Bob Marley also had an untimely death, but he wasn't murdered. There was an attempt on his life, interesting enough, very early on. He was just in his house, and there was a lot of political factions at the time in Jamaica, political gangs, etc. And so they weren't able to ever really tie it to any of the main political figures. But a couple of nights before he was to perform this peace concert with the two guys that were running for president of Jamaica, some guys came by his house one night when he was standing in the kitchen with some of his family and friends, and they just kind of shot into the house. He was hit, I think, in the elbow, and can't remember where else. It was pretty serious, but he recovered, and he was able to. They were minor injuries, I guess, so he was able to go through with that peace concert a couple of nights later. So he died of melanoma, essentially cancer that had started in his toe, and he didn't want his toe amputated. Some say it was because of his religious beliefs. But because he only decided to get a skin graft, ultimately the cancer spread throughout his body and went to his brain. And he was on tour, I think it was in 1980, in the United States. I want to say he had just done a concert in Pittsburgh, and he was out jogging and he collapsed. He wasn't that old at all. I think he was in his mid to late 30s, and they rushed him to the hospital, and they had figured out that the cancer was pretty far gone. And he dies within about 6 months, I think, after that, 6 or 9 months. Again, very charismatic, and I did put some links in here so that you could hear a little bit of Bob Marley. I mentioned the war song, redemption song, beautiful song he does on acoustic guitar. And he talks about mental slavery, and none can free us but ourselves, in a sense, free us from the bondage of our minds. So very inspirational songwriter, and died much too young. The third of the three Wailers, Bunny, is pictured in the middle, he's the only survivor of the three. And then you see a picture of him, most likely in the 70s here on the right hand side of the PowerPoint here. And he still performs. He's pretty old now, you can see from this middle picture. And I don't think he leaves Jamaica much anymore, because he's getting up there. He might not be 80 yet, but he's pretty darn close. Oh, well, I have his dates here, so let's see. He's, according to this, he was born in 1947, so he's like 73-ish, 74. So, okay, he's not as old as I suspected, but very charismatic performer, and yet, like I said, more the soft side in the Wailers. Okay, so that's the Wailers. They took their name from wailing, from literally singing laments. And the reggae style of music, which was popularized in the 60s in Jamaica, had built upon other musical sort of subcultures. You'll hear ska was an early influence. That ska music was kind of a precursor to the mod scene in England, and it's a very kind of fast-paced, fast-tempo music, with a little bit of the backswing on the guitar. And then there's a musical genre called one drop. There are a few of these, right? But one drop was kind of reversing the traditional rock beat, and so it, instead of being on the 2 and the 4, it would accent on the 1, and so they called it the one drop, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. Anyway, and then all of this sort of gets blended with Caribbean rhythms and Afro-Caribbean music and a calypso, etc. And it gets slowed down then in the reggae explosion. And another thing to mention about that's sort of unique about reggae, if you listen to any reggae music, is as opposed to rock and roll, where it's all about the guitar player and sort of him getting off on stage. If you think of the great rock acts like Jimmy Page, right, and Led Zeppelin, I mean, Robert Plant's a great rock singer, but you're going to see Jimmy Page, wank it out on his guitar, so to speak, if I can say that. Eric Clapton, right? Or pick your group. We just had Eddie Van Halen die. He's considered one of probably the top guitarists in the history of rock and roll. And so when you think of traditional rock and roll, you think of a lead guitarist, right? With reggae, the guitar is more of an accenting instrument, and so there's like a backswing on it, ching, ching, ching. And the driving force is the rhythm section, the drums, and the bass. And the bass line almost in a sense becomes a lead. If you listen to real roots reggae, the bass will kind of be all over the place. The drums will keep a driving sort of a drop beat. And then there are various other instruments. There might be horns. There might, with trombone and trumpet, there will definitely be a coterie of backup singers. There will be guys playing traditional conga drums and African style drums, etc. And then there will be the singer, etc. So in reggae music, then you get and maybe some keyboard too, or some piano. But in reggae music, then it's kind of a reversal again of the Babylon rock and roll, in the sense that it's not focused on the lead guitarist, but it's really focused on the African rhythm and the rhythm section in that sense. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and let's see how we're doing on time. We're right at about 29-30 minutes. I'm going to finish up briefly here with just a summary, and understand that this is very broad, very generalized summary of the belief system in Rastafari. And you see some images here. A Rasta flag with the emperor's insignia, the conquering lion of the tribe of Judah. That's a passage, as I said, that comes from the book of Revelation, when Christ returns his second coming to judge the evil and the wicked, etc., and establish his kingdom. You can see in the smaller photo there's a Nyabingi celebration there of Rastas coming together, smoking from the chalice, the ganja, and playing the African rhythms, and then they would get into a meditative state, a trance-like state, and sing laments about being in Babylon, and then also being hopeful about the day that they can be repatriated to the promised land, which would be Ethiopia, the land of the emperor. The picture I put in on the lower right is a Rasta version of the Last Supper, of Da Vinci's Last Supper. I really like this because if you've seen Da Vinci's Last Supper, Jesus looks very lily white. Obviously it's an Italian version of a Palestinian Jew. And so he makes Jesus look like an Italian noble from the 1500s, essentially, in Florence. And here you've got the counterpart to that. You've got the Last Supper with Jesus portrayed as Haile Selassie, as the Ethiopian emperor, with the dreadlocks, though, which is an added Rasta element, right? Emperor Haile Selassie was not himself a Rasta, and therefore he didn't have dreadlocks. But I like that the 12 apostles are grouped in groups of threes, just like the Da Vinci painting, and it's an African, a Pan-African Last Supper. I really like that version there of that. Beliefs in Rastafari. So most adherents, there's a lot of diversity in the Rastafari religion, but most adherents view Haile Selassie either as Jah, right, as God himself manifested, or as some version of the second coming of Christ. There is a group called the 12 Tribes. They're referred to as the 12 Tribes of Israel. And they are a religious organization based in Jamaica, based in England, based in the United States, etc. In the 90s, I had a chance to visit one of their religious ceremonies, and I was really intrigued by it. Some Rasta groups are very closed in the sense that they're only open to those of African descent, because otherwise their religion makes no sense. A black messiah leading the African diaspora back to the promised land, according to the typology. But the 12 tribes of Israel are very mixed. When you go to their religious gatherings, they accept converts, and there are definitely Anglo people and Latinos and African Americans, Jamaicans, etc. And so they're an interesting group. Bob Marley was involved with the 12 tribes in Jamaica for a while, and then Rita was a little bit skeptical of their hold over Bob, and so towards the end of his life, he sort of distanced himself from that particular version of Rastafari. But when I went to the service in Southern California, I was sort of interviewing one of the guys, one of the elders in this group in Los Angeles. And I said, do you believe that, Haile Selassie is Jesus Christ? And he was adamant. He said, no, we do not believe that Haile Selassie is Jesus Christ, but he's Christ revealed in his kingly character. And I thought that's a very interesting way to put that. In other words, the first time that Jesus comes, or the Messiah, he comes as the lamb, right, to be sacrificed, silent before his shearers, according to the Gospels. He doesn't come to condemn, right? According to the Gospel of John, he comes to save and point the way to salvation. From the view of these Rastas in the 12 tribes in this particular group, they believe that Haile Selassie was Christ revealed in his kingly character. So the second time he comes as the lion, the conquering lion of the tribe of Judah, and then they point to his battle against the the Italian fascists, and his emphasis on human rights and African unity and equality, etc., as this kingly lion of the tribe of Judah. So I thought that was very interesting. But many Rastas will simply accept that Haile Selassie is the second coming of Christ, however that's interpreted. Rastafarians accept the Bible. Some of them will only use the authorized version, and they're distrustful of more modern English translations. They think that Babylon, in a sense, is trying to manipulate the prophecies. And so if you listen to a lot of reggae music, especially Bob Marley songs, when they quote scripture, they're quoting the King James Version or the authorized version, the these and the thous and all of that, from the book of Psalms, from the book of Revelation, etc. They do believe that the message has been wrongly interpreted by Western Christianity, by the colonizer, right? And you have to understand that, again, this is a reaction to a history, because Spanish Catholics, Portuguese Catholics came to Brazil, they came to Latin America, Church of England, with its version of Christianity, came and colonized and accepted slaves and the institution of slavery, and they utilized certain scriptures, especially from the Old Testament, that seem to not abolish slavery, but to mitigate slavery. In other words, that slavery could be tolerated as long as the slaves were treated humanely, etc. And so you can see how Rastafari is a black reaction, an Africanist reaction to this twisted white, was perceived at least as an Anglo sort of corruption of the message, the messianic message of the Bible. So it's a very Afrocentric interpretation. In a sense, you could see Rastafari as kind of black Israelitism or black Christianity, and very much a reaction to what had been interpreted previously in the as the religion of the colonizer. Babylon, therefore, represents materialism, the capitalist system, political oppression, and manipulation. It can represent the Western press that wants to defame and say, oh, all these guys are just into dope and drugs, and they're up to no good, and so you can see how they would react negatively to what they perceive as Babylonian slander. Babylon, for some Rastas, simply means the police, and so it could be even black Jamaican police. Peter Tosh, famously at one of his concerts in Jamaica, in Kingston, went on a tirade where he was talking about Babylon this and Babylon that, and he was talking about corruption in the Jamaican police force. He was talking about African guys, or those of Afro-Caribbean descent, oppressing the guys in the slums of Kingston, etc. So sometimes Babylon can be a symbolic title of simply the police. Cannabis or marijuana, ganja as it's referred to, takes on a sacramental nature, much like in Church of England, you would receive the body and blood of Christ, or the Roman Catholic Church, or the various Eastern Orthodox churches. The consecrated bread and wine become the body and blood of Christ for the believer, and they become one with Christ that way. So through these Nyabingi celebrations, the chalice, instead of a cup holding the sanctified wine, right, the blood of Christ, it holds the marijuana, and the chalice gets passed around, and the marijuana is smoked, and it becomes the sacrament, the way of reasoning, right, where then in this meditative state, these songs can be sung about the lament about the downfall of the true Israelites, which are the wayward Africans, those that were stolen from their homes and now are in bondage in Babylon, seeking their liberation. Ethiopia then becomes the biblical Zion, the land of Zion, right? Zion being associated with the city of David and the city of Jerusalem, where Solomon built his temple, and so that becomes the footstool, the meeting place between heaven and earth. So Zion is not in Jerusalem for Rastafari, but is in Ethiopia and Eastern Africa. It's heaven on earth. It's the promised land. And some Rastas following Marcus Garvey encourage repatriation. Now, this is an interesting detail about Haile Selassie, and then I'll go ahead and finish up. He did make a state visit to Jamaica in 1966, and many Rastas flocked out to the Jamaican airport and the runway, to the point where when the Emperor of Ethiopia was descending the staircase, he was frightened, and he went back into the plane for a few minutes before he came back down again. He was afraid of sort of a mob scene, and that these thousands of Rastas that had come out to greet their Messiah would overwhelm him in a sense. And so he had to kind of wait until they chilled out a little bit, and then he descended the steps. He was so taken by their belief, even though he himself always identified as a Christian, baptized, practicing Ethiopian Orthodox Christian. He's the monarch of Ethiopia, right? And he clearly always said, that his duty was to point his brothers to Christ, to Jesus Christ, the historic Christ, right, in the Bible. But he was taken by the Rastafarians' faith in Jamaica, and therefore he didn't publicly shame them or criticize them. And later he was even confronted about that by people, by other Ethiopians, etc. How come you weren't a little bit stronger with those people on that? And he just seemed to be in awe of their faith, and so they perceived that as his humility, and it kind of even added a little bit of their, to his aura in their minds, that he was truly Christ in his kingly character. So very interesting that he himself made a state visit to Ethiopia, and he helped to expand the Ethiopian Orthodox Church in Jamaica. And ultimately, there were some Rastas who converted from Rastafarianism to the Ethiopian Orthodox version of Christianity. I will say this: Bob Marley was baptized into the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and when he died of cancer, he received a church funeral. And it's very interesting, if you see footage of this, that there are these people gathered for his funeral, and many Jamaicans, many Rastafarians there, but then there are these Ethiopian Orthodox priests with embroidered crosses and incense, and they're chanting in Ge'ez, and so it's a real interesting mix going on with the Rastafari and with the traditional Christian Ethiopian Orthodox elements there. So I'm going to go ahead and stop this video. Please enjoy the links to the Wailers songs. I think I've got one from Bunny, one from Peter Tosh, and a couple from Bob. And anyway, I hope this has been informative and illuminating. Thank you.